Welcome to Raising Daughters, the podcast that helps parents learn the best ways to support their daughters as they navigate the high levels of stress, anxiety, pressure, and uncertainty so pervasive in our culture today. Dr. Tim Jordan is a developmental and behavioral pediatrician who has specialized in counseling girls for over 30 years and sheds light on the realities of today's young women in all facets of their lives. This is your opportunity to learn how to better support your daughters, making them feel safe, secure, and truly loved in the midst of life's ups and downs. Here is your host, Dr. Tim.
Hey friends, Dr. Tim Jordan back here with a brand new episode of Raising Daughters. I really appreciate you stopping by. This is a busy time of year. So I know everybody's busy. So just taking a little bit of time to listen in and learn some things about your kids, about your daughters, about raising daughters, I'm really appreciative that you do that. And I decided to have a guest today. About a year ago exactly, I had a guest. I'm not sure if you all listened to it. Her name was Angela Santamero. I'm not sure. Do you know her?
I don't.
Oh, no. She's a co-creator of Blue's Clues and Daniel the Tiger's Neighborhood. So she's
cool.
in the same kind of business as you. So she had put out a new book called Life Clues.
Oh, nice.
Anyway, it was an interesting discussion about, how she got into the business of educating kids and families and all that kind of thing. So I came across your information. I thought it would be also an interesting discussion today. And by the way, I'm talking to Jerry Kolber. And Jerry Kolber's got an interesting background, which he'll tell you about, but he's done a lot of producing and TV kind of work. And he's sort of found himself doing a lot of educational stuff for kids. He had a #1 rated educational series, I think on National Geographic, called Brain Games. Mm-hmm. Another one called Brainchild. And he's got a semi-ish new podcast for kids that I thought would be interesting to talk about. It's called Who Smarted? And he's going to tell us, I hope, how that title got to be. But so, Jerry, thanks for joining the show.
Yeah, thank you. No, thanks for the intro. Yeah, so Brain Games was the first educational series that I did. That was at National Geographic and became a huge hit for them and ran for about 7 years. And the whole idea behind that show was to create a really engaging, fun experience using the television that would help people learn about their brains and just make it fun to learn. And it worked so well that it really validated for me and my producing partner, Adam, that it's possible to make really, really great, entertaining material that's also educational. And so that just validated for us. That's what we've done ever since. Pretty much everything we do falls into that world of super entertaining educational content.
I work with a lot of young women who are in middle school, high school, college, and they're all freaked out because they think they should have their whole life planned out. Yeah. And, they're pressured by their parents and the educational system. Like, what are you going to do? What college are you going to go to? All those kinds of things. And I always tell them they should interview every adult they bump into and say, when you were my age, did you know you'd be doing what you're doing now at the age of, I'm not sure, are you 30, 40, wherever you are? Yeah. So how did you get on this path to do children's educational stuff?
Honestly, no, when I was in college, this is not what I was expecting I'd be doing. I was actually studying theater and film. And so I really thought I was going to work in theater. And I did work in theater for the first couple of years out of school. And I just, every experience I had was both great, but also made me realize I was going to not be able to make enough money to live in New York. I started to realize most of the people making a living, or most people working in theater full time, either were older and owned companies or might have some sort of other source of income and something like that. And through the theater I was working on, I ended up getting introduced to some folks from Universal Studios because they had financed one of the shows I was working on as an assistant. And through that weird connection, ended up working in television. And in TV, I worked on scripted for years. I worked on Dick Wolf, the guy who does Law and Order. I worked on some of his shows. I worked for HBO on Sex and the City, and then eventually ended up working in unscripted television on the original Queer Eye for the Straight Guy as a producer for the first 60 episodes of that show. And that path, it took me really far, and I learned a lot about storytelling and how to create story in documentary settings, doing the unscripted work. But there was a point where I just was getting a little burned out on it, and I had always, sort of if you want to say my side hobby has always just been like, I've always been really curious about science and how the world works and like understanding how things work. And right around the time I was getting a little burned out on doing the reality TV stuff, I heard about an opportunity to work at Nat Geo, running their New York office while the wonderful woman, Kim, who ran the office, was going to go out on maternity leave. And I ended up applying for it. And that is the opportunity where I was able to like bring my love of learning and education together with what I knew about great storytelling and entertainment. And that's where we created Brain Games. Yeah. And science. Yeah. And I don't think I could have done that show any earlier, because I think I had to learn everything that I learned from everything else. Even a little stint I did at Children's Television Workshop like 10 years earlier in 2000, where I saw and understood how they tell stories for Sesame Street. All of that came to be part of the sort of ingredients of what created Brain Games and the model that we still use for our shows. So
we're talking to
long tail, yeah,
long path, yeah. Which I tell young people, that's what you're going to hear from almost every adult you bump into, is they didn't go directly from A to Z. They zigzagged and they meandered, and most people have a long and winding road. Yeah. So we're talking to Jerry Kolber. He is the producer, one of the creators of a interesting and I think fun and educational podcast for your kids called Who Smarted. He's going to talk about that in just a moment. But I want to ask you a few other questions first. I feel like the educational system has sort of beaten the creativity, imaginations out of children, love of learning out of children. Yeah. That's a cynical, whatever comment, but I think it's somewhat true. Do you know who the author Ken Robinson?
Yeah.
He wrote a book about how schools have done that. I can't remember the title of that, but he said the same kind of thing.
Yeah.
I think I'm wondering where you sit on the fence with that, and then is this sort of like a counter to that? What you're doing.
So I think generally I would agree with it. I do know that there are within the educational system, there's many teachers who have made it their own mission to keep things creative in the face of like how hard that is, because the system really was designed and remains designed to create good workers, basically, trains kids to be. Originally our system was designed to train kids to work in industry, and it hasn't changed that much. We've added all kinds of testing requirements and other requirements. So teachers' jobs now are just so different from when I was younger. When I was younger, there was a lot of room for creativity. And I think now with the demands of parents and the demands of the system and the demands of the tests, teachers are really kind of boxed in, and there's not a lot of space for it. So I do know there are a lot of teachers who still figure out how to make space for creativity and make space for fun in the classroom. But man, it's hard. And, I hats off to them, because it's harder than it ever was. So what we try to do with our projects is always create that opportunity for teachers to use without having to do the work. So for instance, Who Smarted, the podcast we do for 8 to 10-year-olds, is 15 minutes long. The episodes are all about science and history. We have 500 episodes. Any topic that a teacher is teaching, they can find an episode. And a lot of teachers now will use our show as just not to teach the kids, but to get them excited about what they're about to learn. So it's a way to kind of like get them to focus, think of the topic as fun. And then when it's time to learn, they're excited to learn, and they're settled and they're ready. So we try and make the teacher's job a little bit easier, using resources like that.
Let me read off a couple of the titles. I watched this one yesterday. I watched today's came out. It was about anxiety, but it was Why Do Your Socks Always Go Missing? Can Some Animals Magically Disappear? Lightning. Yep. Why do bananas go bad so fast? What happens when you mail a letter? Which, by the way, reminds me, my old mentor in Boston, Dr. T. Barry Brazelton, one time, I can't remember, it was some museum in New York, I think, they created a toilet that showed where your poop goes. And where kids could go in the toilet, quote unquote, and go down pipes and all that kind of thing. And they showed the whole process. So I thought about that. That's the same kind of learning it sounds like that you're trying to do for kids.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. I mean, that's a very hands-on experiential. We're doing the same thing through storytelling, right? So we will, like, if we're doing an episode on toilets, the narrator of our show will end up meeting a talking toilet. And the talking toilet will take them on a tour of what happens. And it'll be funny and fun and a little, kid humor, stuff that adults also love. That's the other thing about our shows is we always make shows that are, even if they're for kids, they're still fun for adults because there's a
Mhm.
lot of stuff that a lot of kid stuff that adults don't want to listen to. And we just think there's such a huge opportunity, whether it's teachers in a classroom or parents with their kids, to listen together, that co-listening, and then have a conversation and like learn together and discover together. I just think that's such a wonderful opportunity to make connections and memories. So we really make sure, whether it's Who Smarted or Brainchild, the Netflix series, everything we do, we want adults to have fun watching too. So
After I listened to a couple of the episodes, my first thought was going back. I'm older than you are. I just turned 70. But in my day, we sang nursery rhymes in the car rides to places,
yeah.
and we did things of that sort. And I was thinking one of the best places maybe for this for parents, you may disagree with me, was riding to school in the car, or when you're instead of turning on a stupid TV or people looking at their stupid pads, quote unquote,
Yeah.
that they could put on one of these things and listen and learn together, then have a conversation.
Yeah. Yeah, we've done some surveys and we think about 50% of our listening happenings in the car is happening in cars. Yeah, it's on the way to school, on the way from school, on the way to the grocery store. But yeah, to your point, it's even more so than nursery rhymes, it's something that everybody can listen to and engage with. And I love when we hear from parents that are like, we listen to this in the car rides when I take my kids to school, but secret for you guys is I keep listening after the kid gets out. So,
Yeah.
I love hearing that.
So you're very invested in educating kids. So and this may sound like a dumb question because I think kids are natural born learners. I think kids are naturally curious. But the question always arises, how do you help create a lifelong learner who's interested in learning and will keep learning, especially in this day and age where everything changes so fast. So even as adults, they're going to need to be a lifelong learner.
Yeah. Yeah. So we think about that a lot and where we've landed on that and we've seen research around this and not everyone agree. There's not what I would call consensus, but we feel like the way you create lifelong learners is you teach kids about critical thinking and how to be critical thinkers. Because the only reason you ever stop learning is that you think you've learned everything or you decide you don't want to learn anymore. And I think the only way that you get to either of those is you don't understand how to think critically. Right? Because you feel either bombarded with information and you don't know how to sort it out. So you just kind of tune out, or you get into a silo of information that you decide is fully representational of the truth. And there's everything else outside is wrong. And that also, I think, only happens if you don't know how to think critically. And so we see we don't really say this out loud a lot, but we see our mission as teaching kids how to be critical thinkers and evaluate what's around them, understand that there's lots of points of view. There are some things that are true and factual, and there are some things that are objective and, or subjective and subject to interpretation. So for Who Smarted, for instance, the format is always the same. There's always the trusty narrator going on a journey of discovery. And along the way, there's going to be some fun. There's going to be characters. There's going to be facts, but there's also going to be experiences that we actually will ask the kids questions along the way. So we're offering opportunities for the child to not only listen, but to listen actively so that when we ask them questions and engage them, they're actually having to use their critical thinking faculties rather than just passive listening. So long answer. I think critical thinking is the key to training kids how to be global citizens, in this age when we're just constantly bombarded with so much.
I could also see, like, as you're talking about, the kids are listening with their parents in the car, for instance, an episode, and a question comes up. It'd be a good opportunity for a parent to turn off or to pause and say, "What do you think?" Let your kid, let your kid actually answer the question.
Yeah. We actually build that even in the show. We'll try and build in a little bit of a pause so the kids can, we'll even say, "Hey, we hear you yelling out this answer, that answer," but yeah, I mean, I would imagine some parents would pause and have a conversation. It's a great opportunity.
I learned that the first socks were grass and leaves yesterday.
Yeah, right. I learned that too when I was working on that episode. I didn't know that.
It's one of the funnest things I've ever learned.
Yeah. Like
So thank you for that.
anytime.
Yeah. When you're listening to the tapes, that's one way for, and you ask questions. That's one way for kids to develop some critical thinking skills. How about for parents who are just everyday and with everyday kinds of things? How can parents encourage their kids to become more critical thinkers?
So asking questions, encourage your kid to ask questions. Say, look at something and go, huh, that's the power line. How does the power get through the power line? Or, how does how do these birds fly and land? Or, like literally anything that's around you can become a topic of inquiry. The other thing is with parents, a lot of times kids will relentlessly ask questions to the point where a parent might be, please stop asking questions, or I don't know, or like I don't want to, like that's generally a good way to shut down natural curiosity, right? And so as frustrating and possibly even annoying as it might be when a child is asking you questions over and over and over, there's a version of that where instead of shutting it down, you say, look, I actually don't know the answer. And it's okay to say that, right? As a parent, I don't know. Why don't you look it up? Or why don't we look it up together when we get home? If you want to make a moment, a bonding moment out of it. But encouraging research also is great. Because a lot of times kids are asking these questions and they're asking the parent, and the parent is like, they don't know. And so the parent might feel like annoyed in some way they don't have all these answers.
Yeah.
But rather than like treating that as a moment of frustration, it can be also a moment to sort of help your kid understand how to research and look these things up and be okay with not knowing.
Yeah. I think a couple of other things might interfere with that process. Number one, parents are so rushed and they're constantly rushing their kids. Number two, parents are distracted. Oftentimes they've got their phone out, or they're doing two or three things at once. And so they may miss those opportunities where their kids are, we don't follow our kids' lead enough because when you're following your kids' lead and following their curiosity, there's natural questions that come up that they probably would ask us.
Yeah. Yeah, and maybe if you're really super busy, you say like, get them a notebook and say, write your questions down, and then let's have like a discovery hour together this weekend and go down that rabbit hole. We haven't done this in a while, but we used to do a thing where we tell people, if you go on Google search, there's a button that says surprise me, or there used to be. I think it's still there. Let's see. We're gonna check. It says I'm feeling lucky, and when I tell people about it, they're always like, I don't think that's there. And then they see it and they're like, oh, that's always been there. Yeah. If you click that I'm feeling lucky button, it'll just take you to some random website. And we stopped recommending it because we couldn't figure out whether they were always G-rated or not. We hadn't run into any issues with it, but I was like, we don't know. So, but there are ways, if you just like go on that rabbit hole of discovery with a topic and just start, if your kid's asking a question, say, let's set aside 30 minutes and like explore that later or this weekend, and then really take the time and focus and help them understand how to research and how to look for things.
We're talking with Jerry Kolber, and he is a producer and the one of the founders of a couple of educational products for kids. One of them is the TV show, Brain Games and Brainchild, but also a podcast called Who Smarted, which I would encourage all you parents to look online and get, because it's really fun. It's a fun, interactive, kind of short but sweet way for kids to learn about some interesting things, a lot of kind of sciencey kinds of things that they may have questions about. It's fun for kids. It's also fun for parents, and also fun for you guys to do it together. I'm curious, you've mentioned several times the value of storytelling and how that became sort of one of your MOs, I guess, along the way. So talk about that, and also how parents can incorporate that more into their parenting.
Yeah, sure. I mean, storytelling it's just how we share information as a species. I mean, before we had the written word, before any of that, we were doing oral traditions and passing things down by stories from generation to generation. So it's really it's just deeply encoded in our being and our brains that we like stories. And stories are a way of encoding information that I'll take a step back and say, if you're just giving a child information and you're saying like, open your history book, read pages 10 through 20 tonight and memorize that stuff, that's a very passive experience with no emotion, right? It's just data and facts. And some kids can learn that way. Not all kids do. I was not someone who really learned that way. If you take that same information and you wrap it into a story, so now you're packaging the information inside of a story, and the story has stakes and emotion, you're activating so much more of your brain, and you're actually encoding the information. I mean, this is like just a neuroscience function. You're literally encoding the information in a way that has emotional resonance when it's storytelling, rather than just data and memorization. And if just for an example of this, people, if you ask them, do they remember, when their first child was born, or do they remember where they were on a certain, huge historical event? People can tell you in almost like excruciating detail where they were, what it smelled like, what the day was like, all of these things that if I were to say to you, hey, can you describe exactly what happened to you 9 days ago at 2:37 p.m.? There's no way. Like, you might go back and look and kind of guess where you were and kind of figure it out, but you're not able to recall it immediately with photographic and sensory detail like you can around really emotionally charged events. And I think that when people start to think about that, they start to understand that emotion actually activates your memory in a way and engages your memory in a way that is so deep that you actually encode the information in like this really durable way. And so we've realized that when you can share information and facts and science and history that way, kids are just much more likely to remember it when it's encoded within in a story rather than just delivered as dry information.
We talked a little bit earlier. Before we came on, you were talking about how you have a special interest with your show about encouraging girls to be interested in the STEM kinds of things. Talk about that for a moment, please.
Yeah, so this is something we noticed when we were making brain games initially for Nat Geo, was that most of the scientists on the show were male. Most of the scientists on Nat Geo and all the science channels were male. And we then looked at the data in the science and engineering professions, and something like 45% of those professions are female, right? And so there are a lot of women working in these fields, but it's not being represented in the media in the way that it should be, right? Because when you don't see yourself represented on screen, you might not see an entry point for yourself into these fields. So we made a point on Brain Games of starting to just bring in tons and tons of female scientists, neuroscientists, and experts, just to create that visibility, because we knew that a lot of young girls were watching the show. And then we really ramped that up on the next show we did, which was Brainchild, which was a Netflix science series for slightly older kids and young teenagers. And that show is really about equipping kids with everything from understanding social media to motivation to how the space works. And we did that show with Pharrell Williams and his creative partner, Mimi Valdez. And all of us were aligned on the idea that we really wanted to lean hard into representing society correctly in that show, rather than how it's typically done on television. So volunteers on the show almost perfectly represent the makeup of the actual world, like in terms of backgrounds, ethnicities. We had a young woman host the show, which is very rare for a science show to have a female host. And then our expert on the show was a woman named Allie Ward, who has a podcast called Ologies. She was our regular science expert. And so we've heard from so many parents and young women that show really let them see themselves in the role of being a scientist or being a researcher or going into psychology where they hadn't before. And so that really just validated for us the idea that, visibility is really, really important. It's essential. And so with Who Smarted, our podcast, we do that as well. We make sure that there's lots of visibility for young women and different kinds of kids.
I interviewed an author a year or two ago. I can't remember her name. I should, but I can't. There were two authors for a book. It was through National Geographic. And I believe that it was called No Boundaries. Mm-hmm. And so these two women who wrote the book, they had little 2 or 3 page stories. It was a book written for girls, kind of middle school, high school girls. And these women had these really interesting jobs all over the world. So like if a girl said, I like animals, I guess you can be a vet. Well, there was a whole bunch of other things you could do. Like there's a woman who was studying orangutans, in Borneo. And there was all these, one woman was a volcanologist, if that's the word. Just interesting jobs that kind of open girls minds too. There's a lot of things that you can do that you probably don't see every day to maybe inspire you that, if I can see that, then I can probably be it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you're doing a good thing.
Thanks.
I also was curious about Who Smarted book podcast is geared for kids, I think 5 to 10. Is that accurate?
Yeah, it's more, I'd say like 7 to 10, but I mean, definitely 5 and 6 year olds can certainly listen to it.
And I don't know if you're encouraging kids to listen to it on their own or look on sites on their own. Because I was wondering, were our parents worried about my kids? That's kind of young for my kid to be on, not social media, but you know what I'm saying, the internet, looking for things. And is something naughty going to come on? And are there protections? Is there advertising? I'm just curious about how you handled all those reservations that parents might have.
Yeah. So first of all, we believe like we don't reach out to children directly and ask them to find the show. We know that something close to 100% of the listening is driven by parents, at least initially. In terms of making sure it's in a safe space, so we don't put the show, we don't put it on, like YouTube or any platforms like that where a kid may run into something that you don't want them to. We know that all the listening happens either on a podcast platform where once you're in our show, unless you actively leave the show to go listen to something else, you're not going anywhere else, or it's on our website, which is very much a safe place with no possibility of anything that's not right for a kid being there. But most of the listening is co-listening. Mostly it's happening with parents either in the car or at bedtime or homeschool or in a classroom with teachers. Homeschool families use it a lot. So there's almost always an adult present. If a parent chooses to let it play for their kid without them there, it's just going to keep auto playing to the next episode. Your kid would have to be pretty savvy to figure out, like, I don't know. Also, it's podcasting. Like, I don't know what podcasts they're going to go like find a naughty pod. Like, not too worried about that. And I think parents will know their kids well enough to know whether they can be trusted with it alone. But yeah, most of our listening is co-listening, and we keep very safe environments for both the families and the handful of brands that we bring on as advertisers.
How long has Who Smarted been going?
We're into over our 4th year. So over 4 years. Yeah.
And so how I'm curious about how you've evolved, what you've learned from doing, because I'm guessing you probably evolved.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. Like when we started, we didn't really know anything about podcasting. We were like, let's do a podcast. And then it was like, oh, wow, this is a lot of things you have to learn. It's sort of adjacent to television production, but the world's quite different. And one of the biggest things we learned is that with TV, you kind of have to ask permission to make the show. You got to get money together. And then the network really owns the show and the relationship with the audience. And we never really understood that until we started podcasting and now have a very direct relationship with our audience, which we love. We love communicating with our listeners. We love that they'll email us, ideas from them. We do shout outs for the kids. So this direct relationship, it allows us to see the impact we're having. And it allows us to hear from our homeschool parents and our regular parents and classroom educators, like what's working and what's not working. So we're able to evolve in response to that. One of the things that we realized about a year ago is we were hearing from a lot of teachers that they love the show, but they couldn't use it in their classroom. They couldn't use Who Smarted in the classroom because Who Smarted has ads on it, and they didn't want ads in the classroom. But they also didn't necessarily have the, I think it's like $40 a year to spend on the ad-free subscription. So we said, all right, that's easy. We're just going to offer an ad-free version to all classroom educators. And so now any educator that wants to use Who Smarted in their classroom without ads, they just go to whosmarted.com, click on educators, enter their email, and within a minute, they're going to have a subscription they can use. And, we don't necessarily make any money off of those episode plays, but we're really impact driven more than anything. And so for us, it's exciting to know that more teachers can use Who Smarted in the classroom that way.
So what's next on your trail, on your path?
Yeah, we're working on a new idea right now that'll come out next year. That's going to be like a short, under 10-minute show. That's almost like the audio version of Brain Games in a way, where it'll train your brain by giving you historical examples of someone who's achieved something, and then explaining what the brain function was that allowed them to achieve this breakthrough, and then actually training you a little bit. So you're on the way to work, and on the way to work, you might learn a little more about critical thinking, or how to be logical, or math, or how to solve math problems, or how to memorize things, and how to remember names, all of these different things that we all want to get better at. We're uniquely suited to do that because we've been doing that kind of stuff for years, and we love creating fun, short educational snippets. So that's going to be coming out in 2025.
And you have a good track record, so I guess that would help open up more doors for you.
Yeah,
you've been doing this for a little while.
Yeah.
So we've been talking to Jerry Kolber. He's the creator. He's a producer for a podcast for kids and parents called Who Smarted. And I want you to, if it's okay, I want you to email me these links. You can say them now, but I want you to email them to me, because on my show notes, I will make sure I have links to however you want people to find you or find your stuff.
Yeah. I mean, the simplest one is just go to whosmarted.com. From there, you got your links to listen on Apple or Spotify. You can listen on the site. Educators can get their free subscriptions there. Homeschool parents, if you email us, we'll give you 50% off the subscription. That's all through whosmarted.com. If they want to check out our other stuff, it's atomicentertainment.com, ATOMIC entertainment. But for purposes of what we're talking about today, whosmarted.com is the best place to go to find our stuff. And of course, you can just type in Who Smarted into any podcast app, and you'll find it.
It'll pop up. Thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it. And good for you for the work that you're doing. It's unique. It's different. I'm glad you're doing something that's for kids. I don't know that much, but there's not that much on the market for that, I don't think.
No, not enough, honestly.
So you're filling an important niche. So good for you.
Thank you. This has been
thanks so much. Yeah, thanks so much for being on.
Thanks.
So that was interesting. I hope all of you parents check that out. Go to wherever you get your podcast, wherever you get this podcast, Raising Daughters, and look up Who Smarted. You can also look online, like you said, and get links and all that kind of thing. I think I listened to several of them, and I thought they were fun and interesting, and they're short and sweet. These aren't an hour long. I think they were 5 to 8 minutes long, most of them, the ones I listened to. And I think your kids would find them fun. And they're interesting. They're interesting, kind of quirky topics that I think do interest kids. So I think it would be well worth your time, and listen to them together with your kids, so you can then ask more questions and have a conversation, and then you're part of the learning process. I'll be back here, as always, with a brand new podcast in a week. If you have questions, send them in. Send an email to my wife, Anne, ANNE, at drtimjordan.com, and I will try and send an answer to you, or do it here on the show. Thanks so much for being here today and listening to Jerry Kolber. I'll be back here in a week with a new podcast. Thanks so much for stopping by.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Raising Daughters. Hopefully you've learned something useful about girls and young women and how to help them navigate the pressures, challenges, and opportunities of modern life. If you want to become a more effective parent, keep listening to the show at drtimjordan.com and let the conversations shape you. Build that one-of-a-kind connection with your daughters in the most profound and meaningful ways possible, shaping them into strong, confident women of the future. That's all for now. See you next week for another episode of Raising Daughters.